Well, good evening, and welcome to the final talk of the 74th season of the Amos Fortune Forum. Ordinarily, we'd be starting out listening to the bells of the meeting house toll 8 times to signal it's time for the Amos Fortune Forum show to proceed. But sadly, we weren't able to do that this year, and we're hoping that it will turn around next year. So I am Dick Ames, and I am very honored to be moderating tonight's talk. Ted Widmer is our speaker. He will speak about his book, published in 2020, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. It is an amazingly good book. I encourage you to read it. After his talk, Ted will answer your questions. You can submit your questions by placing them in the chat comments column, which will appear on the right of your screen. And I should add here that Ted is not feeling well today. Woke up not feeling well, and he was going to come to Jaffrey to give his talk here at his mother's house, but decided to stay at his home and is proceeding, and we thank Ted for proceeding, notwithstanding not feeling well. So Ted Widmer grew up as a frequent visitor to Jaffrey, where his grandparents Ed and Caroline Reed retired, and where his mother, Ellen Whitmer, has a house just a short walk away from the meeting house. He attended Harvard as an undergraduate and graduate student and received a PhD in the history of American civilization. He has taught at Washington College, Brown University, and the City University of New York, where he is now a distinguished lecturer teaching in the Macaulay Honors College. He also was a speechwriter and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton between 1997 and 2001, and a senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in 2012 and 2013. And I need to add, as a personal note, due to a friendship with Ted's parents that goes back to graduate student days in the 1960s, it has been my very good fortune to see, mostly at a distance, Ted emerge as a thoughtful, informed writer and an important contributor to our public discourse. As Ted proceeds, remember that you may submit questions, and to do so, you type them into the chat comments column, which you should be able to access on the right of your screen. So now here I present you Ted Widmer for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Dick, for those beautiful words. I'm really sorry not to be there in Jaffrey with all of you tonight. I would have been speaking by Zoom even if I had been there, but I'm grateful to Zoom for letting me speak to you all even while I'm not there. I got a bug in the middle of the night, and my doctor urged me to lie down all day, so I'm speaking while lying on a sofa in Providence, Rhode Island. I apologize for the informality. As someone who's been giving Zoom lectures a lot in the last year to my students, not only do they attend the lectures lying in bed with a pillow, they often fall asleep as I'm in mid-lecture. And I hope to avoid that. It's not too bad if a student falls asleep. It would be a problem if I fell asleep in my own lecture, so I'll do my best to avoid that. But everything Dick said about coming to Jaffrey as a child is true, and it had a very powerful influence on me. I felt like I was privileged to visit one of the most beautiful towns in New Hampshire and really all of New England, and I loved the opening montage, and I prepared a slide lecture. It's a rather full slide lecture, so I don't want to take too long. And if Andrea can help me to begin it, you'll see how similar I was thinking, my thoughts were to those of the montage, because I began with a picture postcard view that will be very familiar to all of you. I just found it on eBay and took the picture to begin the slide talk, but I wanted to pause a minute with this image you all know so very well, because it's really a vision of democracy as well as a vision of New England architecture and a vision of the form of religion that brought so many early settlers to New England. And as I first encountered this shot, it was often coming up to the green to play baseball with my grandfather. Dick mentioned him, Ed Reed, who was a retired headmaster. There were quite a few retired headmasters in that era, and I wouldn't be surprised if they still are there. And it felt to me often like I was entering a classroom of American history. Here you have not only a building that was once a religious structure, but always a place for town meetings, as it is in theory tonight, but also the little schoolhouse. And the early settlers cared about education, obviously. And with the Amos Fortune Forum, which I remember going to probably since the early 70s, so, a place for civic uplift, for neighbors to come together and see each other and talk to each other and hear a speaker and feel like they're part of a stronger community. So I felt very much the democratic message of Jaffrey as a young person. Andrea, if we can go to the next one. And the connection of the meeting house to American history couldn't be more immediate. The building was finished on the day of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was a very important battle. It was really you could argue, the battle that really began the American Revolution. And so it was a coincidence that the building was finished on that day, but it fed my notion that somehow this was a school house of American history to grow up into. Okay, Andrea. And yet it was also a selective schoolhouse in some ways. Here you see the horse barns next to the meeting house. And as I got older, I realized that not everything in the postcard view was the same as other communities. And as you all know, in the township of Jaffrey, you have the town of Jaffrey, which was growing, begun later, and grew in a different way for different reasons. But industry and railroads were obviously coming more into Jaffrey than into Jaffrey Center. And in other ways, I would say Jaffrey Center was actually atypical of American history. And I want to just briefly pay tribute to the man whose name we honor tonight, Amos Fortune, whose life I've always been vaguely aware of by walking through the village and seeing the sign describing him and his wife. I think I might have read that very good children's book a long time ago, but I did a little more research on Wikipedia and in other places, and really was moved by the story, the incredible story, and the nearly unique story of an African. He was African, not African American, although he became African American, who freed himself through an agreement with his master in Woburn, Massachusetts, then bought the freedom of his first wife, and after she died, he bought the freedom of his second wife. So that's 3 emancipations right there. That would already be remarkable, but the part of the story that seems so normal when you're in Jaffrey, and really is not normal at all for the history of the United States, is the story of a Black man coming into a community and being embraced so wholeheartedly by the rest of the community, and giving so much to the community, including the funding that ultimately led to this lecture series, but also, I believe, a silver communion service, and contributed to education funds in his lifetime, and really was a remarkable citizen of Jaffrey. And I want to come back to that word later, citizen, because it's an important word. It's a word the founders cared a lot about, that you're not simply entitled to certain rights, you give back to your fellow citizens. And it was really that idea that Abraham Lincoln was fighting for as he took a train ride that was extraordinarily difficult in February 1861 to make it to Washington to become the president. So, okay, Andrea, I think we have a few more from the Jaffrey section. This I just found doing my research. In 1968, one of the most tumultuous years of American history, Jaffrey was presenting a very traditional image of itself. Next one, Andrea. I was interested in signs of the Civil War in and around Jaffrey. And of course, there's this statue in front of what is now the library. And I was able to find the history of the town of Jaffrey and do some reading in it. I just had a suspicion that the Civil War, which is a little hard to detect around the meeting house, because the image presented by the meeting house and Melville Academy is really a kind of utopian idea of what America felt like between about 1800 and 1850. Civil War begins in 1861, and yet I just had a feeling that it deeply affected the lives of people in and around Jaffrey, and it did. I read that town history, And by my calculations, 149 young men from Jaffrey alone served in the Union Army, and 26 of them were killed. So you can imagine the kind of trauma that a bucolic town in southern New Hampshire experienced as the best of its young men were going thousands of miles to the south to fight a kind of abstract war to defend American democracy, and how that war became less abstract and more vivid, and why it was so important is something I'd like to talk about tonight. And I want to mention also that 3 young men of Jaffrey were killed at one battle alone, the Battle of Antietam, which was a real turning point of the war. It was a, a modest victory for the North. Both sides lost terribly, huge numbers of men, but it was a victory for the North, and it was enough of a victory for Lincoln to feel confident to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation is such a major turning point in American history that the Battle of Antietam should be remembered for what it did to make that possible. And to learn, as I did, that 3 young men of Jaffrey were killed in that battle gave me a sense of pride in Jaffrey and what it did to shape not just its own little postage stamp of territory, but the entire nation. Okay, Andrea. As I did more research, I couldn't help myself. I wanted to study the history of how railroads came into the community. There was a station in East Jaffrey. There's a photo of it from 1890. I believe it lasted until about the 1970s. Next shot. Well, it's a little hard to read this map, but it's a map of Jaffrey, of the township from 1877 that shows basically the reason economic energy began to ebb away from our postcard toward Jaffrey, what used to be East Jaffrey. And the reason is that dark line flowing right up toward East Jaffrey, which was a railroad that linked Jaffrey to Winchendon, Massachusetts. It was conceived in 1868, only 3 years after the Civil War ended, and begun in operation in 1870. So the Civil War had a lot of impacts. It wasn't just that it ended slavery and brought in some very important constitutional amendments, but it also unleashed a lot of new economic forces. And the railroad, which existed before the Civil War, really takes off a lot more afterwards, including its arrival in Jaffrey in 1870. Okay, next shot, Andrea. And this is the old sign that would greet you when you came into what is now Jaffrey. It was then East Jaffrey. I found this image online, and I called it the end of the line because that's what Jaffrey became in 1972. The Peterborough branch was discontinued. So Jaffrey was briefly the end of the line from 1972 to 1984 when freight trains stopped. Passenger trains stopped in 1953. And also I thought it was a little bit amusing because so many people think of Jaffrey as a retirement community, which it wasn't what it was for my grandparents and so many others. And who knows, maybe for me someday. So those are my Jaffrey photos just to begin a discussion of why I fell in love with American history and why I always sensed that railroads were very, very important, especially in the 19th century. So now I think we can go into the story of Abraham Lincoln with the next image. So this is where most books about Abraham Lincoln, our most famous president, begin. It's the day of his inauguration, March 4th, 1861. You see a big crowd coming to the Capitol. It's a little hard to see, but I hope you can see it. And for me, this was not the beginning, but the end point, because as I studied Lincoln, which I did a great deal over the last 20 years, I realized how possible it was that we would never even have known our greatest president. It's illogical and really anti-historical in a way to be speculative like that. But as I looked more and more into the transition between his election in November 1860 and his arrival in Washington, I realized there were so many ways it all could have fallen apart. It was really hanging by a thread. And here you see a Capitol building that is not finished, and that's how America felt in so many ways. Next slide, please. So here's his very famous first inaugural address. It ends with a beautiful final paragraph about appealing to the better angels of our nature. And that's written on the piece of paper that he taped to the upper piece of paper. And that too is a sign of how much was coming together in the final moments before Lincoln became president. Okay, next slide. So here's another photograph of the Capitol from a year earlier, and I include it because of the body of water that's in front of the Capitol, which was called the Washington City Canal, and it was toxic, like the politics of Washington in 1860. It was filled with deceased animals and raw sewage, which could easily be smelled inside of the Senate and House chambers of the Capitol. And in many, many ways, Washington was a deeply dysfunctional city, probably built in the wrong location, too far to the south, and not near decent arteries of transportation. Certainly not in 1800, not really in 1860, when the United States is a huge and sophisticated country, but it's extremely difficult to find a train that will take you to Washington, D.C. Okay, next slide, please. So that's just one of a lot of challenges Lincoln is facing. This photograph is taken 2 days after his nomination to be the Republican candidate at a convention in Chicago. And the Republican Party was a new party. It wasn't a national party, and it had very little federal experience. And yet conditions were becoming so toxic, as I said, and in other ways, other political parties were falling apart, that suddenly, the way that election happened, Lincoln became the strongest candidate by virtue of the fact that the Democratic Party could not hold together as one party. It split into northern and southern branches, like so many things were doing, including religious denominations, the Baptist Church. There's still a Southern Baptist Church dating back to this period. So Lincoln, although a minority candidate, and he won with less than 40% of the vote, the second lowest vote in American history for a successful president, after a president I admire greatly, who I believe is a relative of Dick's, John Quincy Adams. But it's shocking, I think, to realize that Lincoln, our most famous, our most beloved president, had the second smallest vote of anyone ever elected to the office. So that's one of his challenges. Another is to form a federal governing party out of a party that's very, very new. And then a simple one is just to make it to Washington, D.C. And as I thought about it, I realized I had a kind of adventure on my hands. I had mostly written pretty academic history books, but now I had the story of a man with enormous pressures on his shoulders, trying not only to keep his party together and to start his own presidency, but really to keep the country together at the worst moment in American history. And in order to do it, he has to survive a journey of nearly 2,000 miles from Illinois to Washington. So that became the theme of my book. And Andrea, if we can go to the next slide. This is a photo that was only discovered recently on the day Lincoln was elected, November 6th, of a column being raised in a building that is very far from finished. So the U.S. Capitol was important for me throughout the book as a symbol of how broken America was. And Lincoln is coming in to fix it. And I want to end this talk with a few remarks about what the Capitol has meant in the year 2021, because in shocking ways to me, the themes of my book about a long ago period became current again as the Capitol once again became a kind of battleground. Okay, next slide, please. So Lincoln is also changing, like the country. After he wins the election on November 6th, he goes to Chicago to have a photograph taken, and it's clear something is happening on his face. He's beginning to grow a beard and to grow into the more patriarchal Lincoln we know and love from the photographs. I think we mostly think of Lincoln as having a beard. He did throughout his presidency. But it's very interesting. He was actually a young man. He was 51 when elected and 52 when he started the train trip to Washington. And I think he was trying to give himself a little bit of gravitas, but in many ways he is changing during this crucial transition, which I think is unusual. Okay, next slide, please. So all these other tendrils of the story began to become apparent to me. And there was one that was absolutely amazing that I had never read about before. And I was so grateful to the people involved with this story, not only for giving me something exciting to write about, but for saving the life of Abraham Lincoln. So you may have heard the name Dorothea Dix. She's a decently well-known social reformer of the mid-19th century. She was born in Maine, grew up in Massachusetts, including some time in Worcester and some time in Cambridge. She worked to reform female prisons, but her real area of expertise was mental hospitals. She traveled around the country convincing states that building mental hospitals was humane policy and just benefited everybody. And so she was welcome in the South as well as in the North, where she'd done a lot of work with Southern legislatures. And in the fall of 1860, she was coming up through the Deep South, including South Carolina, as it was beginning to secede. It is the first state to secede after Lincoln's election. And with her friends who were legislators and prominent people in the South, she picked up very clear evidence of a plot to assassinate Lincoln on the train trip, even before he could become president, on the train into Washington. And she understood even where it was most likely to happen, which was in Maryland, where there are a couple places where the train is exceptionally vulnerable to sabotage. So she did what a person like Dorothea Dix would do. She wouldn't go around asking for help. She solved the problem herself. She figured out who the CEO was of the railroad that went from Philadelphia through Baltimore to Washington, and she marched into his office in January 1861. And I believe that's our next slide. So this is Samuel Felton, the head of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, a native of West Newbury, Massachusetts, another country town, not unlike Jaffrey at the same time. And he went to Harvard College as an undergraduate and really liked science and went into railroad engineering, not being the engineer of a train, but designing the tracks. And he worked a lot in Massachusetts. And I think the next slide will show us that. So many of you, I'm sure, have been to Walden Pond. There's a feeling of sentimentality between residents of Jaffrey and Henry Thoreau, who, of course, made Walden so famous, Henry David Thoreau. But if you look in the upper right-hand corner of this image, you see a diagonal line that is the train that Samuel Felton built that goes almost over Walden Pond. And it's funny, we think it's a bucolic escape from cities, and there's a train almost bisecting Walden Pond. And it was even there when Thoreau wrote his book. He talks about the train in Walden. And that was Samuel Felton who put the train through. So he was a very competent railway engineer. Okay. Here's a map of that terrain. It might be a little hard to see, but you can see the train between Philadelphia and Baltimore goes over a lot of inlets There are a lot of small rivulets in Maryland that flow into Chesapeake Bay. I lived in Maryland for some time, and it's very, very beautiful. But you understand the importance of these small rivers where people love to go duck hunting or kayaking, and they all were right underneath the railroad bridges that Lincoln was going to travel over. So that was one way in which the railroad line was very, very dangerous. Okay, next slide, please. The man on the left is Alan Pinkerton, and he is another key to the saving of Lincoln's life. So after Dorothea Dix told Samuel Felton about the plot, Felton also was very self-reliant in the way so many New Englanders were back then. And he found the best railroad detective in America. It was Alan Pinkerton, based out of Chicago, an immigrant from Scotland. He and Lincoln had actually met each other because Lincoln did a lot of legal work for the Illinois Central Railroad in the 1850s. So Pinkerton comes out with very little time. There are only a few weeks before the train trip is scheduled to begin. And he brought 8 agents with him, a lot, but not so many when you consider what they were up against. And if we can go to the next slide. Remarkably, one of them was a woman named Kate Warney. I believe that's how we pronounce her name, although I'm not sure. So 2 women, Dorothea Dix and Kate Warney, were absolutely instrumental in the saving of Abraham Lincoln's life before he could become the president. And by extension, you could say they saved the idea of America. They saved the United States of America. Kate Warney was a widow in her late 20s, and she needed work, and she went to Pinkerton and said, I can do things that your mail operatives can't. And he was a little skeptical, but he gave her a chance, and she immediately became one of his best agents. And she's in fact buried next to him in his family plot in Chicago, Illinois. She's an absolutely fascinating figure. It's very hard to find out a lot about her. Pinkerton kept notes about his operations, so I was able to find some information about her there, but she did not write about her. She was a secretive spy to the end, and so we don't know her own version of this story, except there are a few letters she wrote back to Pinkerton from the train trip describing Lincoln as looking very tired. And I thought those were quite moving, actually. Okay, next slide. So the train trip begins on February 11th, 1861, but a great deal is unknown about it, including will these spies working to save Lincoln's life be able to foil a very sophisticated plot involving perhaps as many as 1,000 people around Baltimore and Washington. It's also not known which states will be in the Union by the time he gets to the so-called capital of the so-called United States. 7 states have seceded. That is known, but a couple are teetering, and they're very important states. Virginia is one, and Maryland is another. Maryland is intending to hold a secession convention while Lincoln is on the train. And if Maryland secedes during his train trip, he probably can't even get to Washington because he's going through what has become a foreign country. So, and that would have had immense ramifications. If Lincoln couldn't make it to Washington, he wouldn't get to the symbolic buildings that, like Joffrey's buildings, do so much to define the way we think about democracy, mainly the Capitol and the White House. But the Capitol is more than just the place where the House and Senate meet. It's also the repository of all of the documents of American history. The Library of Congress was then in the Capitol. All the treaties, all the bills, everything that has made America America is in that building. So if Alan Pinkerton and his team cannot protect Lincoln and get him into that building for his inaugural address, a very different version of America, of American history, is about to begin. I think Lincoln probably would have gone to Philadelphia and tried to improvise a new government with no government building to go into. And that would have made the waging of war that much harder also. Anyway, so all of that is unknown on the first day of the trip. And a lot of Lincoln's friends are really afraid. They've been writing letters to him saying, don't do it. Don't go through Baltimore. We already know they're trying to kill you there. Take a secret way of getting there. Go with an army that will protect you. And Lincoln says, no, I'm getting on this train. I've announced that I'm speaking at all of these places. I'm going to do it. And Lincoln understood it was not only an act of personal courage, but it was very important for Americans to see a president coming in normally and acting like a president, including the giving of speeches. But of course, by giving a speech, he's exposing himself to a huge crowd in which anyone might have a weapon. So there was tremendous drama just in the fact that he went out time and time again to give speeches to people. This was the first one, and it's a very interesting speech, which I want to speed up my own presentation so I can hear all of your questions. But he improvised a beautiful speech about leaving a small town that meant a lot to him. No president had ever given a speech like it. All political speeches by presidents up to that moment were about grand matters of state. And here Lincoln is just saying, I've loved living among my fellow citizens. I've been here a long time. You know me. I'm leaving. My children were raised here. One is buried here. And incredible emotion in this speech. And I think he invented a new kind of speaking by presidents with that little farewell speech to his hometown of Springfield. Then as the trip continues, he greets huge crowds. I'm sorry, the image is so small, but there are tens of thousands of people here in Cleveland. He's a tiny stick figure sticking out from a balcony. If you Google Lincoln in Cleveland, you might see this image a little bit more clearly under a big American flag. And it was that way everywhere he went on the trip. The trip was very successful in the North. People were scared, and they appreciated that Lincoln was coming in person to talk to them. So the first half of the trip was a big success. Okay. Here he is in New York again, fearlessly going on the balcony of an important hotel in New York, near City Hall in New York, on Broadway, Lower Broadway, and gave another speech to a huge crowd. Walt Whitman was in the audience, saw Lincoln for the first time, and wrote beautifully about what Lincoln looked like, how he looked different from politicians. He looked more rough-hewn, more from the country, had more of a country accent, which we don't always think about. But even Whitman said he could feel the presence of people who hated Lincoln in that crowd in New York City. And New York City also was kind of on edge because it had so much trade with southern ports that there were a lot of people in New York, including the mayor, who were talking about creating some new political organization in which New York would be sort of a neutral city, neutral with the North and neutral with the South, which again would have shattered our idea of what America is. Okay. This is the only photograph of Lincoln from the trip. The trip was 13 days long, and he made a brilliant decision. I believe it was his decision, but as he's planning his train route, he often went to state capitals where he could go into a state house and talk about democracy. It was a pretty smart idea, but he understood also that the most important building in America that wasn't the Capitol or the White House was in Philadelphia, and it was right on his way, and it's Independence Hall. And it's where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and it's where the Constitution was debated and signed. And Lincoln, even though he had less schooling than almost anyone who had been president before him, I'd say less than anyone except Andrew Jackson, and less than almost anyone since, he had a very sophisticated understanding of American history, and particularly the Declaration of Independence, which he talked about beautifully in his rise as a politician, but also on this day when he went into the Independence Hall and said, every feeling I've ever had about politics and about America stemmed from the Declaration of Independence and the ideas contained within it. And it was a brilliant way of talking. It was patriotic, to be sure, but Lincoln also understood that much of the Declaration of Independence, although written by a slave owner, Thomas Jefferson, with important help from John Adams, is a document about human freedom and human rights and the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all three of which are impossible if you are enslaved. So Lincoln was more centrist than the abolitionist of upstate New York and New England, but he was profoundly anti-slavery in his way, and he understood that arguing through America's great documents and persuading people why slavery didn't fit with the better angels of American history was a better way to reach the vast middle of America, which is whom he was always trying to speak to. So this is a powerful moment. He goes into this building he's never been inside of. He gives a beautiful speech to a big crowd. And it's also the last day of the trip and the most dangerous day of the trip. And Lincoln ends his remarks by saying, "I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender the principles I believe in." And it wasn't just hyperbole. He'd just been warned by Kate Warney the night before that a vast plot to take his life had formed and was concentrating around the city of Baltimore. Okay, next shot. So you can't really see because the map is too small, but Baltimore had 3 stations. And if you came in from one direction, you would have to transfer by horse and buggy to go through the crowded streets of downtown to get to the station where you needed to go to. Lincoln was coming into a station on the northeastern side and needed to get to a station on the southern side, which is now near the Camden Yards baseball park. And it was probably in his horse ride with a carriage through the crowded streets that he was most vulnerable. And so that's what Pinkerton believed. So what Lincoln finally did was he did all of his public events in Pennsylvania. Then he got on a secret train that went all night with ordinary commuters on it. And he made it into Washington at dawn the next day. And I think I have a shot, the next one, of the train station he came into. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I wanted to mention Frederick Douglass because as Lincoln is coming into Baltimore and hiding in the back of a train with Kate Warney next to him, protecting him, he's basically simulating what was another very famous train ride of the 19th century when Frederick Douglass, as a slave in Baltimore, put on a sailor outfit and walked onto a train in Baltimore in the same station Lincoln was coming into. So that's another way I found this a powerful story of Lincoln understanding what it felt like to be a slave escaping because so many people wanted to kill him and he had to conceal his identity. Okay. This is a pair of brass knuckles that Alan Pinkerton had with him and now in the collection of Ford's Theater in Washington. Okay. This is the station that he came into. It was very near the Capitol, not too far from where Union Station is now, but a little closer to the Capitol. And he came in at dawn on the morning of February 23rd, 1861. He was the most famous man in America, and he got off the train, and no one was there to receive him except an old friend from Illinois who had been tipped off by telegraph, but they had to use code words. And they got him into the Willard Hotel, a hotel that still exists. And once he was in his room, he was finally safe. And the city went crazy with the knowledge that he had arrived a day early, in part because so many people didn't expect him to show up at all. And there was a feeling that a coup was in the works, that Lincoln would be killed and Southern militias would come in from places where they were very strong in Virginia and also in Maryland to the north. Washington, D.C. is surrounded on all sides by people who want to see Lincoln fail or die. And there were persistent rumors throughout this time that a Southern militia might have taken over the Capitol at exactly the moment they were trying to kill Lincoln, and it wouldn't have been very hard. It wasn't very well defended. So we dodged a different history by a bullet, as it were. Okay, next slide, please. So here he is a day after his arrival, and he's doing what Lincoln did so well. He's looking presidential. His beard has grown out. There's the conspicuous top hat on a table. This was taken by Matthew Brady. And he's basically saying everything is normal and American history will continue. But we know American history was not normal. He had barely survived his own train trip in, and the Civil War had not yet begun, but it was coming. And nothing about the Civil War was normal. It was the most destructive, the most lethal war in our history, still far more lethal than World War II. And it left tensions that we thought incorrectly were resolved for a long time. I mean, most of my childhood and early education, I thought of the Civil War as an episode in our history, pretty far back in our history. And it's feeling in 2021 much more than World War II or World War I, which came well after the Civil War, that it's not quite over, that we're still living with these raw wounds about race, about federalism, about how we teach our history. And so I discovered that the history book I was writing had a little more relevance to the present day than I first understood it did when I started the project. I think I might have a few more, Andrea, but I'm mostly done. So 6 weeks after Lincoln barely survives his train trip through Baltimore, the first soldiers from Massachusetts come. They're called the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, specifically to defend the city of Washington from all the people in Virginia and in Maryland who want to take it over. These are very brave young men from Massachusetts, and a riot broke out as they marched through the streets of Baltimore, and people were killed on both sides. And some people consider this the first battle of the Civil War, and it actually happened in a northern state. It didn't even happen in the South. It happened in Baltimore. And among the people killed were people from very near New Hampshire. There was a young man from Lowell who was in this regiment who was killed. There's still a monument to him in downtown Lowell, Massachusetts. So New Hampshire and Massachusetts were involved in the protection of Washington, D.C. Okay. And so I'm near the end now, but I wanted to come back to the word citizens, which I mentioned earlier. Here's an image you all know. It's Amos and Violet Fortune with the very beautiful epitaphs written by the minister about living reputably and dying hopefully. And everything about this broadcasts the news of a healthy community. The most obvious and surprising fact being that an African-American couple were allowed to be buried in the village burial ground, the place of a religious and a political community, and they were welcomed into it, and they deserved to be because of how much they had given back to Jaffrey. But this beautiful image, which is part of our postcard, really was not a part of American history before the Civil War. When African Americans were buried, we still are sort of discovering African burial grounds. There's one in New York City. When they are discovered, they're always at a remove from the community, and there aren't stones, and there are not names. And the naming of African Americans was a complicated topic. Most slaves had no last name. And here, obviously, Amos and Violet Fortune have names, and I believe there are birth dates and death dates, and all these markers of civic belonging. And I cannot stress enough how important that was to get right in our history. And Lincoln understood that. The Supreme Court decision that had violated that idea was the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which said no person of African descent can ever be a citizen of this country. That's what it says. Citizen is the key word. And Jaffrey knew better. And Lincoln knew better. And I want to end with one final shot with a discovery I just made, which is that Willa Cather and her lifelong editor and, I believe, romantic partner, I don't actually know and I don't need to know, but in a tolerant way, they too are buried together in this beautiful civic monument. The cemetery itself is a civic monument, so fittingly adjacent to the meeting house. So I went on a little longer than I meant to, but I hope you all know your history so well. I hope you got something new out of that. I'd love to take any questions.
So here we are. Ted, that was a wonderful talk, and I thank you for it. At this moment, I don't have questions from others, so I have a few questions.
Oh, great.
I'd really like to start with sort of the method of your effort here in that led to the production of this book. And it's an amazing story. And at its core, it's just a 13-day railroad trip. And it's titled Lincoln on the Verge. It could as well be America on the Verge, it
Absolutely.
seems to me.
That's right.
And you've done this remarkable job of finding connections everywhere he went, practically everyone he spoke to. And, you know, we discover that J.D. Rockefeller was there, and it's an occasion sort of to tell the story of oil and the takeoff from there, from where it started. And Thomas Edison, I believe, comes into the picture somewhere along the line, and Walter Whitman for sure. And a bunch of others. And then there are characteristics. There are changes in the infrastructure, the railroads. You've already spoken about the railroads, and Lincoln enabled that even more so as a president. So I wonder if you could talk about how the heck you put this together. How did you find all these connections?
Well, I did a ton of research, Dick. I thought this book might take me 2 or 3 years. It took 9. I'm a little embarrassed about that, but I'm not embarrassed about how much research I did. I found one resource I want to identify. It's called Chronicling American History, and it's an online resource co-hosted by the Library of Congress and the NEH. And if you go into it, you can find almost any small town newspaper that is in the Library of Congress or in a lot of local libraries. Also, thousands of small town newspapers are there. And so I just looked up every town that the train went through, and I tried to find if I could find a local newspaper article, and there were a lot. I mean, it was a major news story. To see Lincoln coming through your town was a really big deal. And many of these writers were very talented. They would talk about the wrinkles in his face or the expression in his eyes, and kind of painterly descriptions of Abraham Lincoln in a way I found extremely valuable. I also did a lot of railroad research. I mean, thank you for mentioning that. It's almost as much a book about how the train is changing America as it is about how Lincoln is saving America. And those two things sort of flow together because the railroad economy that had built up around the tracks was very powerful. And the North had more strength than it first understood. The South had more political strength, and it really sort of owned Washington, D.C. in a lot of ways. It's a southern city. It still is a southern city. But once this huge railroad economy got engaged in the war, the production of weapons and uniforms and glass for eyeglasses for soldiers to aim better, it just was overwhelming. And I thought that was an important part of the story I wanted to mention too. So the South were very politically ambitious. They felt like they owned America, but they weren't creating very much economic value except for slavery. And the North really was, in a way that I think it was important to me to bring out. And I think we have elements of that tension in our pretty bitter political debate today, where, and I want to respect political sensitivities, but I think there's a feeling in the redder parts of the redder states that the last 20 years of economic history passed them by and left them out a little bit. That's not a racial statement or a statement about liking Barack Obama. It's just an economic feeling of powerlessness. And I think we need to dive deep into that question too, about why people, including in northern cities, feel that politics has left them behind, and why they would then embrace a pretty cynical political message.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I suppose a related question, and you touched on pieces of this, but you are an historian, a good one, I would say, with a focus on American civilization. And you've written about it, you've taught about it, and you've spoken about relationships of that past that you've researched and studied to our present. And what I'm trying to get to is how you feel we're doing in our schools, in our colleges, in helping young people to understand our history that you know so well, in a way that would be helpful to them as they mature into the people who are going to be running this country. It's a broad question.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's just so volatile out there. There have been tremendous gains in American history in the last 10 or 20 years, and we understand the history of women. I mean, going back to the late 1960s, that's been a revolution within American history. And I'm proud of putting a little bit of women's history into this book. We're doing so much better in African American history, and that was really important to get right. And before that children's book about Amos Fortune came out in the early 50s, very few books on any kind of Black history were available in any public libraries in America. And so it was important to get right, and we are getting right. And there are great books coming out and great up and coming new scholars, white and Black, of slavery. So that's all wonderful, but there's a very serious pushback too. And in a lot of Southern legislatures, there are rules, Texas, for example, mandating how American history should be taught. And you cannot mention slavery unless you put a sort of soft language around it. It varies from state to state. And I don't think we are at peace with that topic. I think it's still, and parents are on school committees and take a very strong interest in how everything is taught to elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. And so it's not easy to just change the writing of American history. It's really being fought locally all around the country. And I should say I have my own mixed feelings. I genuinely love the strength and vitality of the Black history and women's history. I thought there were pretty profound errors in the 1619 project, even though I liked it overall. I thought its energy was incredible and the literary grace of the pieces was incredible, but where it touched upon topics I know very well, like Abraham Lincoln, in my opinion, it failed to present a complete picture of someone who was in the middle of the greatest emancipation effort in our history and was really sort of pushed to the side as a racist with selective evidence that didn't tell the whole story. So I thought it was an excellent and much read effort, but it sometimes failed to live up to its own high standards.
Fair enough. I think one last question. Nothing's showing up in the comments section. So I'm going to do one last, and we only have a minute or a minute and a half. But you described, I think, this evening as Lincoln as a moderate, not really committed enough to abolition to be applauded by abolitionists. And you also describe him as an apostle, a bearded apostle of change.
Right.
How do you put those two things together?
Well, among other things, he was a very savvy politician. I don't think it diminishes our admiration of him to say he was really good at politics, much like Franklin Roosevelt or Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or George Washington. You know, all of the greats understood they had to do politics in order to make the change then happen. Lincoln was about exactly as anti-slavery as he needed to be to win the nomination and the election in 1860. So if he had been even a whisker more clearly abolitionist, he would not have won the nomination. He was the perfect man from the perfect state at the perfect moment. And William Seward, who was much more credentialed, was a little bit more anti-slavery at that moment and lost for that reason, because they really wanted to win states like Indiana, or the southern parts of Ohio, or parts of Pennsylvania that are near Maryland. They wanted to win those centrist parts of the country, and they did. But then Lincoln always had a great capacity for growth, and I think that's one of the best things about Abraham Lincoln. And even on this trip, his speeches just keep getting better and better and better. And by the end, he's talking in accents that sound to me not so far away from the Gettysburg Address. But he met with African Americans. The same meeting that is cited by the 1619 Project as an example of his gaucheness was actually, I believe, the first time a president had ever met with a group of African Americans. And he was listening, he was reading the newspapers, he was growing. And when in 1862, it's only a year and a half after he's become the president, he decides to greenlight emancipation, he's actually ahead of most of his cabinet at that point and ahead of a lot of American public opinion. So he's gone from behind the abolitionists who, you know, Boston and upstate New York abolitionists probably represented about 5% of the country's political feeling. Lincoln suddenly in 1862 is really pushing broad social change in a way that's very heroic, and he does it. He signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Civil War becomes a war not just to suppress states in rebellion, but to end slavery. That's what we think of it as. It was a war that ended slavery, and that's because Abraham Lincoln made it that way. So I hear the people who find fault with certain things he said or wrote, and good for them for calling our attention to it and not turning him into a saint. But also, by the same token, they should pull their camera back and see how significant the change was that he enacted as president. And the person who was the best informed in America on this topic was Frederick Douglass, former slave, the leading abolitionist. And he said, this is absolutely incredible. I never saw it coming. I never saw it coming from him. And he gave two really important eulogies of Lincoln after he was killed, where he talked about that. So I just wish we could all hear Lincoln as he sounded to Frederick Douglass at the end of his life, as someone who had had a big personal change, and because of that, the country had a big national change.
Good. That's an excellent place to leave it. Outside my house, you may have heard them ringing as Ted finished his remarks, were the bells of the meeting house at 9 o'clock. So, Ted, thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Say hi to Heather.
A million times.
Love to say hi to everybody in person as soon as I can.
Yeah.
And thanks, Mom.
Okay, it's so we have to bring this discussion to an end. It's just the way it is. And I'm sure that all those in our remote audience join with me in saying thank you to Ted for a very interesting and I think extremely important presentation. As a small and very traditional token of the Amos Fortune Committee's appreciation, you, Ted, will be the recipient, if you have not received it already, and I think you probably haven't because you're still down there in Rhode Island, a jug of New Hampshire maple syrup.
Thank you. That's great.
I also wish to thank the Amos Fortune Forum Committee and its leadership, Nan Biter and Rosemary Putnam, and all of the members of the committee for putting together this year's terrific speakers program. And I also want to give a special thanks to Andrea Cornelius, who successfully guided others and tonight successfully guided Ted and myself through the mechanics and technical aspects of this season's dependence on the internet. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Andrea. And to all of you in the audience and to all forum friends, we look forward to actually seeing you and one another next summer. Here's hoping, in person, when our forum, celebrating its 75th season, will present us all once again with a roster of excellent speakers. So thank you and good night.